Hi, my name is Shawna Lucey, and I am here with my sister, Dr. Colleen Lucey, in order to have a sibling debate about the piece, Eugene Onegin, Yevgeny Onegin. To give you a little idea of my sister's biography, Dr. Lucey is a scholar of Russian literature and culture and language. She is a professor at the University of Arizona, and she has a forthcoming book coming out this fall called Love for Sale, which is being published by Cornell University Press, which examines commercial sex in imperial Russia. That's my sister, and we're here to have a debate. She's going to tell you a little bit about who I am.
Yes, so it's my pleasure to introduce my sister, Shawna Lucey. Shawna is an opera director based in New York City. She's traveled all around the world, producing different operas, and her most recent productions include Pearl Fishers at Santa Fe Opera and a new production of Tosca at San Francisco Opera. And she's particularly well-versed in discussing the Russian repertoire because she lived in Russia and is fluent in Russian. And she lived in Russia for 5 years, where she earned an MFA from the Boris Shukin Theater Institute. So this knowledge that she brings is not only one of linguistic expertise, right, but also her background in opera will also, I think, give us a lot to consider when we talk about Eugene Onegin, or in the Russian, Yevgeny Onegin.
So we wanted to give you a sense. We are not Russian, okay? No. It just happened. It just turned out that we both really loved Russian literature and then decided we had to just really focus in on it. So it's our pleasure to talk about Eugene Onegin. I'm gonna throw the first question to my sister because we're gonna do a little sister versus sister debate about Yevgeny Onegin. So Colleen, tell us a little bit about the story of Yevgeny Onegin and its significance in Russian literature and culture.
Okay, so what I love about this text is that a critic from the 19th century, Vissarion Belinsky, very important for the period, said it's an encyclopedia of Russian life, Yevgeny Onegin. And if we think about the text, and I'm going to give some spoiler alerts here for the audience, so if you haven't seen it or read it or listened to it, you just pause this, I guess, and fast forward through it. But the plot is relatively simplistic, and this is true of all of Pushkin's texts. It's not about the plot so much. That's not where the treasure rests in his art. It starts off basically as a portrait of Eugene Onegin. He's a dandy, a westernized individual, a man of means in St. Petersburg in the capital, but he's kind of got ennui or spleen, sick of the high life, and he travels to this country estate where his friend Linsky kind of shows him around and takes him to visit Linsky's love and his betrothed, Olga. Now, Olga has a sister, Tatiana. So if Olga is a socialite interested in parties and socializing, Tatiana is more of a bookish, sensitive character. So Tatiana immediately falls in love with Onegin.
Of course.
How could you not? This man from St. Petersburg, the capital, who's come to your rural village. And she writes this beautiful love letter to Onegin. Confesses, very bold, confesses her love for him. Onegin, somewhat maybe harshly or cruelly, basically says to her, listen, be careful of these kinds of things. I could use this against you, or I could love you, but I'm so disillusioned with life, I wouldn't be the right man for you anyways. And he cautions her, okay, so somewhat paternalistically. And later on, Onegin goes to Tatiana's birthday, her name day party, and Linsky and Olga are there, of course. And Onegin, because he is this kind of rake, begins flirting with Olga, Linsky's girl. Linsky is horrified, he's angered, and he challenges Onegin to a duel. So these two friends, best friends, duel to the death, and Onegin, spoiler alert here, kills Linsky. So cut down to the prime of his life, right, Linsky. Onegin then leaves and travels abroad for a couple of years, and he returns back to Russia, and he finds Tatiana completely transformed. She's married to a general in the original text, and a grande dame of society. And now the tables have turned, and Onegin is in love with her and declares his love. Tatiana says, I still love you, but time has passed and I'll be faithful to my husband. Mm-hmm. So that's the story in a nutshell. Its importance to Russian culture and the literary legacy. Well, it's kind of hard to, you can't say it enough. The reason why this text is important is that all of Russian literature will kind of continually go back to this source text and the characters and mine it. So writers continually feel something about Pushkin's text that make it relevant for their own period, making it their own, which is why Tchaikovsky, I think, found in this story something particular for audiences that could then capture the audience imagination.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I feel like I've held my own there in this debate. So
pretty good, Sissy.
So one thing that continually fascinates me is Onegin's character. Clearly Russian, westernized to a fault, kind of alienated and superfluous to society, always complex. But for you, what do you think, as an opera director, you're staging this, what do you think makes him tick?
That's a great question. So Onegin is a complicated character, right? His both like fancy kind of educated boredom, that he's seen it all, he's experienced it all, and nothing really turns him on. It makes him that kind of like bad boy, which I think we see in TVs, movies, films, books. It's a classic kind of a character of that kind of man who, women want to transform. They want to like hook in, like my love can save you and bring you back to see the beauty of life, and all of that. And, it's a great character because not only does it exist, of course, in every kind of culture and every imagination, it's a contemporary character too, like to feel disillusioned. I mean, I think disillusionment is something that happens with every generation and fights through and trying to, convince someone that, oh, look, my love can transform life for you. So we're already in a good place in terms of building the character. And just to give you guys a little context, my sister and I often, go back and forth discussing these things because she's an incredible resource for like historical documentation. So when and cultural relevance. So when I'm preparing a piece, we often have these like lengthy discussions. She gives me reading lists. I do I depend on her expertise, and it really helps to center that kind of character choice, so that, my directing style isn't like, let's put Onegin on the moon with pudding. That doesn't mean anything to me. It means some things to other people. It's just not my voice. I want to delve into Eugene Onegin to understand like his character and Tatiana, and like why would we still care about these characters today? I mean, obviously, Tchaikovsky's music can transport us to like a different land of emotion and reality. But I want to make really specific choices as a director that come from the piece itself, that come from Pushkin's text, that come from Tchaikovsky's music. And so having these kind of debates about like why is Onegin this person, this character who like is the foundation of like Russian cultural identity, It's a great way for me to like delve in.
Well, it's so mutual, right? Because it goes both ways. This is what's great about the conversations that we have, is because you as an artist bring forth things in the text that even if I've read a text multiple times, I've taught the text, I've written about the text, I've researched it, you find things in it as an artist that I've never thought of before, right? And you, by placing it, the aesthetics of transposition onto the stage reveal to us, I think, as scholars, as literary critics, things that we would never consider, right? Because you bring the artistic voice to the text. And even if it's text that maybe were meant to be produced on stage or not, it brings the text to life in an exciting way. So it breathes life into these texts that are hundreds of years old,
It's an exciting exchange. All right, my turn.
All right.
You ready for your next question?
I hope so.
Talk to me about Tatiana as a character. Okay. Like how common, like the idea of like writing a love letter to some guy you just met in 19th century Russia. I mean, Was that common? Like girls did that all the time, or is it bold? Tell us a little bit about that action.
So I think of Tatiana's action. This is a great question because, and again, you ask the right questions because these aren't questions that we normally would ask of a text, right? Where is she in time space in terms of her social milieu? How unusual is it that she makes this bold step? I think that it is bold, and the text itself shows us what kind of high stakes there are for women and for men in courtship rituals. So writing a love letter may not necessarily be totally transgressive, but the responses and the reactions to public displays of affection that could break taboos or break societal norms could really throw things out, haywire for women. Look at Olga, for instance, Olga and Linsky. The fact that Onegin flirts with Olga at a soiree leads to a duel that ends in Linsky's death. So the stakes are really high, of course. The stakes are high. And Tatiana's love letter makes clear that she lives at this moment in the text. And again, we have to remember that Pushkin writes this text over several years. He's not serially published, right? So it's not that he necessarily knows how it's going to end, right? He might have an idea of it, but he himself is changing. So Tatiana changes with the text. And I mean, it's a beautiful kind of homage to Tatiana as a muse in the source text. But to go back to the question of Tatiana and how bold this move is on her part, it's also bold Onegin's response. He could easily use this to have an illicit love affair, ruin Tatiana's life, her chances of getting married. She'd be an old spinster, God help her, and her life would be over.
No one would ever invite her to dinner again.
It would be pretty much persona non grata. So it is bold what she does. And Pushkin, in realizing this, I think, gives Tatiana this, I guess the spirit of the age is what I would call this kind of boldness, this love for life. And he gives this to the characters that he loves most. It is unusual. And I think, again, the stakes, we just have to remember that Tatiana is taking a risk. And this is also something we love, and I love about Pushkin is that he was a risk taker too.
Yeah. It's interesting because, of course, Tchaikovsky's music for her letter encompasses that in a way, that like love of her and of her boldness and of her riskiness. He totally gets that in the music and that art.
That's so interesting.
I'm going to jump in. I know you have another question for me, but I'm just going to respond.
You're right.
I'm the older sibling, so I do what I want. You saying this about Tatiana and how Onegin could use this letter against her and ruin her. It's interesting because when I'm thinking about the piece today, like what 19th century Russian story, like what does that have to do with like your average teenager or college student? Why? It made me think about this current cultural obsession with cancel culture. That people are so up in arms about like, oh, somebody got canceled and why do we cancel people and all of this and that. And I keep thinking to myself, why is anyone acting like cancel culture is new? Cancel culture has always existed, especially for women. If you color outside of the lines, canceled. I mean, that's why I was asking you about Tatiana's letter. Like, is it common? Is that usual for a girl to write to a man of her own volition to say like, I'm in love with you? It seems very bold, very risky. And if he had acted upon it, like as you said, I mean, Tatiana's life would be over. She wouldn't have children. She would never have a family. Her chances of marriage would be over. She would be an embarrassment to the family. She would be canceled. And so the way that the piece itself kind of demonstrates people's dancing with being canceled. So it's like Tatiana goes up to the edge. And only because Onegin doesn't act on it does she manage to like escape danger. Same thing with Linsky. Once he challenges Onegin to a duel, they're best friends, right? And he has one of the most beautiful pieces of music in the whole opera, talking about, before the duel. He doesn't really have a choice to not go through with the duel. Like if he doesn't, it's going to be, we're skating on that cancel. Now, of course, because he's a man, it's like much less likely he's going to get canceled. He can get away with basically anything, but it's going to be problematic, right? And so the piece itself, I think, in thinking about staging it today, I think there's something really inherently interesting about cancel culture with it.
So you touched upon something that I think is very important, and that has to do with Pushkin's own biography of censorship. Pushkin, in writing this text, he was internally exiled to the South. The Tsar became his personal censor. Talk about problematic and hard to deal with skate that thin line. But in terms of the cancel culture, I think also too, what the text does a really strong job of, and Tchaikovsky pulls out, is that what you noticed is that people live by prescribed norms, right? Tatiana has her life plan before her, Olga the same, Lenski, Onegin, but they also are kind of living out their best selves as they relate to literature. So all of them are kind of living out these idealized versions of what they've read. And each of the characters is deeply rooted into a particular literary movement. So Lenski is very romantic and sentimental. Onegin is this this disillusioned upperclassman. Tatiana is the lovesick heroine. And what Pushkin does is undermines those trajectories within the text. And again, I think this is the beauty of the art that we see from Pushkin's point of view, that he's able to self-ironize within the text. And this, I would say, is the major difference, I think, between the opera and the written source text, is that the narrator, who plays this major role in Pushkin's novel in verse, which talk about what the heck that means. What is a novel in verse? This narrator is absent, right, from Tchaikovsky's opera. And the narrator continually pulls us outside of the text in Pushkin's original to comment on it, to talk at length about Tatiana's beauty and her being his muse. This is compensated for or kind of elaborated on in the music in Tchaikovsky's version, whereas in the source text we have the narrator. So an important difference, I think, both works of art are beautiful in their own ways, but very different in that respect.
That's one of the things I love about the various forms of art, is the way they play upon your imagination and your like psychological understanding of a piece. Because if you're reading the literature, you're like getting this narrator perspective, and if you're watching the opera, what you get instead is the Tchaikovsky narrator carrying you along melodically, and filling in without words, but rather this other like consciousness.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of the opera, I have a question for you I want to hear this from your perspective. So when you're staging this opera, what do you think about as a director in terms of design, in terms of character motivation? These characters, as we've said a couple of times, could be very distant from us. They are of a different era, they're from a different culture, they speak a different language. So what do you tell your singers to get them into a mode of thinking about making these characters their own?
No, that's a great question, because, in terms of Tatiana's choice at the end, right? When Onegin comes back and says, "Oh my gosh, I'm passionate about you. Let's get together." It's hard for a modern person to understand, necessarily the inherent like, well, no, I'm gonna choose my family. I might not be in the most passionate, loving marriage, but I'm gonna choose that over this like impassioned love affair. And yet, even as I say that, I know that people make that choice every day, right? People choose not to have affairs. People choose their families over self-interested, pleasure. So, this thing of, okay, it's 19th century mores, and that doesn't really respond to me as like a, 21st century person, isn't really true, because it's the same human struggle, right, between duty and passion and self-interest, right? So, we don't know in the piece, like Tchaikovsky doesn't tell us, Pushkin doesn't tell us, like, does Tatiana have children? One can assume. And if she were to run off with Onegin, one thing we can tell you, in her being canceled, is that she would never see her children again. And that's a choice that I feel like people in terrible circumstances, even today, face. And it's too grave a choice. It's like, and in that way, both Tchaikovsky and Pushkin acknowledge like Tatiana's growth.
Yes.
As a person that says, life is full of chapters, and when I was young and a little bit foolhardy, I had this passionate love. The passionate love still exists, but it's not nearly as important as the passionate love I have for my children or for my, family life in general. And then in terms of your question of design, it's a really fun process because, of course, it's like I've seen other productions of the piece. I know it. I've seen it in Russia. I've seen it here. And when you're approaching a piece that you've got to go back to the music. You have to go back to the music. So, for me, so what I do is there's just a lot of listening to the music over and over and over again. I like to take long walks and just listen to the music and try to let my imagination go, even as I'm passionately researching. So that's like historical context, social context, literature, like the biography of Pushkin, like every little bit and bob that went into the piece. So all the facts are there, and then you let the facts go, and you just let the music, because, the music will tell you so many things, more than, almost anything when you're preparing an opera. As important as the text is, the music is going to let you release your conscious mind so that you can make these artistic choices that are meaningful. And that's how you end up with like a design process and that is meaningful because it comes from the music.
Right, it's organic, like you were saying before. It's something. It's not Pushkin on the moon and pudding, right? Which might mean something to somebody, but isn't naturally grown from the text and the process and from the music. Like you were saying, that's very interesting.
All right, so I've got another question for you. We've briefly mentioned Pushkin himself. And I just wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit about his biography, about how he was viewed by his society at the time. Just a little like insider info.
Okay, so there's so much to say about Pushkin. It's really hard to condense it down. I'll do my best, okay, the best that I can. But there are many great biographies that I would recommend, to people to read, to delve in. There's such a rich biography. I said earlier that he could have represented, or Tatiana represented, a spirit of the age. And I think Pushkin himself did as well. He was born in 1799 from an aristocratic family, nobility. Interestingly enough, his great-grandfather on his maternal side was from Africa. He was a slave who then became Peter the Great's favorite and then was promoted within the court and became a favorite of Peter the Great. So he has this African heritage that he's very proud of that comes up every once in a while in his poetry. And is very, very present, I think, in the Russian mindset about Pushkin, this kind of this mixed background. And I said that he was a creator of a national literature, but I need to kind of give some context to that because we think about Shakespeare maybe in a similar way. But Pushkin didn't just write poetry. He wrote novels, dramas, historical novels. He even dabbled in folklore. So he really hit all of the different genres that you possibly could. And then he popularized them in this way that made it readable. So prior to Pushkin, really wasn't, the literary language really wasn't mature. Pushkin takes the language and then allows it to mold into something that can encompass all the different registers present at that period. So we have Old Church Slavonicisms, we have Archaic Russian, we have Low Russian, we have French sayings that we're going to borrow and we're going to incorporate. And he makes it all okay in Eugene Onegin, right? He makes that okay for future writers in this way that you can't praise this enough. He was a poet from a very young age. He was praised as such, but he was also a rebel rouser. He wrote an ode to liberty that got him into hot water with the Tsar, so he's placed into internal exile in the South. He always wanted to go abroad, but never could. The Tsar becomes his personal censor. He embodies, Pushkin, I think what is so interesting about his biography is that he embodies a lot of paradoxes that makes him, even as later writers like Gogol and Dostoevsky will try to memorialize him in different ways, and have a kind of cult of Pushkin. Can't forget the man's individuality. So he was both deeply agnostic and also religious at the same time. He was a womanizer, but also devoted to his wife later on in life. And if we think about an artist's life as their art imitating life and life imitating art, Pushkin is really the prime example, because this moment, right, in Yevgeny Onegin, in which Linsky challenges Onegin to a duel, knowing kind of full well that it's probably a death sentence for at least one of them, is then later on something that Pushkin goes through himself. He dueled many times, and dueling was illegal at this time, so it was hush, 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 of course. But he dies in a duel under slightly similar conditions, right? The honor of his wife is questioned by a foreign attaché who's serving the Russian court, and Pushkin has his manhood challenged, right? And this, above all else, must be protected.
Oh, yes.
Nobody wants to be a cuckold in their own time. So he then challenges to a duel, and he dies. And this, cut down at 37 years old, born in 1799, like I mentioned before, and this becomes kind of a legacy for writers. You cut down kind of right in your prime.
Oh, yeah.
You go out in the flame of glory, if you will. So Pushkin is very much a man of his age, but he's also in this in-between zone where he is deeply enamored with the West, but also connected to his Russian roots and the nanny that brought him up and the stories that he heard in childhood. He has this African heritage, but is also deeply connected to the nobility. Again, these kind of very rich contradictions within his biography that always feed into the art, and is very interesting to mine that.
And it's very connected to like Russian identity. The symbol of Russia is the eagle that has two heads facing both east and west. And there is that duality in Russian culture where it's like they're neither Western nor Eastern.
Right.
They encompass both, and they kind of straddle both spheres, and they pick and choose, and it makes this really complicated identity. And so it's like, did Pushkin create that, or was he a product of it? It's like.
Well, I think, the Russians have this saying, Pushkin naše всё. Pushkin is our everything. And I think that is true. And for a while, I didn't really understand. It took me many years to understand what they were getting at. And I think, again, you're kind of touching upon it, that duality. The dynamism in that duality creates so much tension and so much rich complexity that it produces really wonderful artists, oftentimes who are in conflict with the government, whether it be an imperial bureaucratic one, or if it's the Tsar's chancellery, or if it's a Soviet period, or if it's a contemporary moment right now.
I was going to say, or if it's Serednikov right now.
Right.
We
the director of and the artistic director of the Gogol Center, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So we see artists in conflict with the government and the ruling factors throughout the history of Russia.
It's like Mandelstam, another fantastic poet of the 20th century, would say, poetry is a serious art. You can die from it in Russia. So I'm paraphrasing, of course, but many artists knew this firsthand. And Pushkin himself wasn't. It's not like he wasn't connected with this. I mean, he had friends who led an uprising, the Decembrist uprising in 1825, and he was closely connected with them, could have possibly been there if things had gone a little bit differently for him. And many of them were hanged or sent to Siberia. And Pushkin has a moment in the text where he even, in his drafts, where he draws a picture of him of bodies hanging in the square. He says, "I could have been one of them."
Yep.
So this is like, these are real questions for Pushkin, and of course we don't necessarily see all of them in Yevgeny Onegin, but you can see them in Pushkin's later art, certainly.
That's interesting, because also thinking about Tchaikovsky as another Russian artist in conflict with the culture himself, of course, the likelihood is that Tchaikovsky was gay, and talk about cancel culture, like not allowed, not accepted at the time. And the way that Tchaikovsky suffered because of that, that pain of the rejection, the ostracization, the the inability to like accept that as, you know, an A-okay part of himself, because that's not an option. You know, knowing how much he suffered throughout his life with that, and that he put that pain in his music, that genius work, is really interesting, because I feel like Pushkin's conflict with his own identity, though different, of course, because it you know, didn't have to do with sexuality, but all of these like conflicting parts of his nature, his character going into his art, it's there in the Tchaikovsky as well, you know, and that Tchaikovsky would have really understood these conflicting feelings of the characters of Eugene Onegin, not just because it was like, you know, it's Russian national literature that every Russian can tap into psychologically and get there, but also the pain, the personal pain that each of the characters, I feel like, navigates. If it's Lenski, who knows he's going to likely die in the duel, or if it's Onegin with his like, why can't I be happy and just engage in life? I think is an interesting way to kind of connect those two artists.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is it your turn or is it mine?
I think it's your turn.
Okay, great. Colleen, you know, you are a very successful professor of Russian literature and language. Could you tell us, like, how do you teach Onegin in class? And do you bring the opera into the classroom? Is it useful? Like, how do contemporary college students respond to Yevgeny Onegin?
Okay, so you know, Onegin is one of the primary texts that we would teach, that I teach, in like a 19th century survey. So a big survey of the works that matter to Russian, basically the development of realism. Now, the difficulty from the American perspective is not only that this text is so removed from our experience, but that it's written in verse. And this is something, as Americans, we don't typically delve into poetic texts. If we do, it's only in a cursory way, and maybe
it's Shakespeare.
It's Shakespeare, right? So you have to change your mindset somewhat. So I begin with a kind of explanation of what the beauty is in the verse itself. How can we appreciate poetry? What does it mean that Pushkin writes a novel in verse? Already, we're talking about a hybridity that is new for the era. Novels, you think about Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, right? The long novel, these baggy monsters. Poetry requires economy of style, a paucity of text, a precision of word. So have two different genres meeting. We're going to try to get the psychological state of the characters, which is something that the novel gives us. And we're also going to try to get at the beauty of life experience with the specific word, which is what poetry gives us. These two merging together. So I talk about that, and I think that and you have to slow down. You got to slow down. You can maybe breeze through a quick novel.
So you're saying that Yevgeny Onegin is not a TikTok video.
It's not a TikTok video, although it could be the subject of one, maybe. But if you get down to the plot, I mean, like as we went through it, the plot's pretty simplistic, right? But I think slowing it down and then going into the original, especially for the students who are learning Russian, is very helpful because the text is very real. And this is a language that we can relate to as people who are learning Russian language. And I bring in Vladimir Nabokov's famous kind of understanding of the Onegin verse. So one of the great things about Pushkin is that he creates a totally different, unique verse style for this novel in verse. It's 14 lines. It's kind of like a sonnet, but it's still his own. And Nabokov uses the metaphor of a spinning top. So when you spin a top, if you can imagine, you can see the beginning at the start of the spin, and at the end, you can see the patterns. Right? And this is kind of what happens in the Onegin stanza. At the beginning and the end, it's really clear what the message is. But in the middle, the action takes place, right? The movement, and things begin one way and then they could end totally in a different perspective. And this is what this is the art form that he gives us. Now, I mentioned earlier on that Belinsky, this radical critic, called Yevgeny Onegin an encyclopedia of Russian life. And this is true, but what does it mean? So encyclopedia we think of Wikipedia in our in our day, gives you the basic facts about a specific thing. Well, Eugene Onegin, of course, it's at its best moments when it gives us the realia of the day, right? What it was like for the aristocracy to visit the theater. How did nannies talk to their to people like Tatiana, for instance? How does samovar work around the table drinking tea? But it also gives us, in addition to the realia, a beautiful snapshot of moments in which a kind of historical legacy is being transformed within Russia, right? It's we're right at this moment, we're on the edge of kind of bringing Western culture into Russia and adapting it and assimilating while holding on to the Russian traditions. So piecing that out from the text, and also you asked about the opera. The opera, I think, is really important to bring in because it gives us a most condensed, synthesized form of the characters, right? When you read the text, the narrator is so present, so dominant. And Tatiana and his love for Tatiana becomes the arch symbolic element within the text. Tchaikovsky steps back and again gives us a kind of blow by blow, and then the beauty of the language can be heightened in the music. And listening, even if you don't speak Russian, you can still get it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The beauty of the music will just take you right away.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question for you, it goes back to Tatiana, because we talked a lot about Onegin, we talked a lot about Pushkin, but I want to go back to Tatiana because oftentimes when I teach this text or I read about it, but especially in the classroom setting, it's one of the most common responses, and I completely understand, I have it myself, is that Tatiana, why can't she? Isn't this her just upholding the patriarchal norms of the period? Oh, and how lovely that she remains with her elderly husband and conforms to her role of wife and possibly mother. We don't know. Again, we don't know that in the text. Rather than embarking on this adventure with Onegin, she should be able to live out an autonomous decision-making process, and whatever the consequences may be. For me, and it's very hard to deal with this question, but it seems to me, because again, it points out that she's just upholding the traditional norms of femininity, which are always based upon self-sacrifice, beauty, motherhood, and so forth. But you've hit on something about Tatiana's character that I think is really important. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, from your perspective, how do you see her as somebody who owns their own agency?
Right. Yeah. So I think I also understand, there is that impulse of like, why doesn't she just go and enjoy herself? Good Lord, like leave this elderly husband behind in the dust and passionately get that thing that she wanted, which was this, love affair with Onegin. And, I think a lot about, because, feminism is kind of like where it's my grounding place from which I examine all of my directorial works. There's no way for me to divorce feminism from my staging. It just has to be there because that is who I am. And in thinking about feminism, especially contemporary intersectional feminism, there has to be an acknowledgement that the existence, like the life existence for women, is always bittersweet. And what I mean by that is, no matter what happens in your life as a woman, let's say you climb the corporate ladder, let's say you have the family you've always wanted, you're never going to be able to do every single thing to 1,000%. And what I mean by that is like everything from what kind of childcare support do we have? None, right? In the United States. So you're trying to work and you're trying to be a perfect mother and you're going to fail at both. Like you're not going to be great at both of them. And something's going to give. Something's going to get messed up. And so every success as a woman, I feel like, comes with a price tag. And it depends on what you're willing to pay. Like, what is a price that's too high to pay? And for me, it's like thinking about Tatiana's choice, like, yeah, it'd be great. I'm like thinking about it like a contemporary woman. It's like, yeah, it'd be great to go to Cabo and like have a hot weekend with Onegin and then come back to your like family life. But like, what option is that? I mean, that's not the option that like women walking down the street here in New York City have. I mean, it's not a lot of marriages that can sustain that sort
long
of
term.
Yeah. And again, knowing, okay, so sure, we don't have the social strictures that Tatiana would have faced, where it's like, if you go with Onegin, you never see your children again, right? It's not like that. It's like, if you have an affair and your marriage falls apart, like, you're going to talk about joint custody, et cetera, et cetera. But not always, right? And thinking about her choices, thinking about the richness of life, again, it's kind of like Tchaikovsky himself, right? Like knowing the pain of the deep desire for that pleasure, that like sexual intimacy, that passion, and knowing you have to deny yourself it. I mean, it's a similarity, but with the repression of queerness in historical context, and the repression of women in historical context. And so knowing that there's no way you're going to get it all. That's just the name of the game. Something's got to give, and you're going to give up something, is a great way to like engage with a singer who's taking on this complicated role. And I'll just also say that it's that question, as you were asking me, I was thinking about it in terms of like encounter relief to the men of the piece and their emotional journeys, because, if you think about where Tatiana starts and where she ends, it is like pretty intense.
Yes.
Like that is like quite a journey of sacrifice. And I'm not saying that Lenski's like going to a duel is not nothing, but it's also a little bit like you said, like, okay, well, our manhood got challenged, so we got to like head to it's a little bit more simplistic. You know what I mean? The same thing for Onegin. Like, I'm tired, I'm dissipated, I'm not so interested in life. Like, you young lady, you think you want to have an affair with me, too bad. Oh, now I'm ready to have an affair with you. You're like thinking about these emotional arcs of these characters. And Tatiana's is the one that is so deep. It is so deep because it has so much to do with duty and sacrifice and love and passion and sexual intimacy. And it runs the gamut, you know what I mean? And that, that's the interesting thing about feminism, right? Is that it's deep. It encompasses every aspect of life giving, of death, of all of it. So, I mean, I understand that the impulse, like, get out there, girl, and enjoy yourself. What you doing? Like, staying with this old husband. I get that, but also, that's the essence of being a woman, right? Is that something's going to give, you're not going to get everything.
And this, to me, I mean, it's amazing that Pushkin could, from his perspective, get that, I think, in a way that it seems it's so far removed from him personally.
Yeah.
But he did. He must have understood it. Otherwise, he couldn't have written it this way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's interesting. Colleen, what didn't we cover? I mean, as you can see, we can
go
just
on and on and on
and talk about all of these pieces of Russian literature.
I think, we covered as much as we could from the landscape. I mean, from the period, to give you a sense of what Pushkin is thinking about when he writes the text, the trajectory that he goes through as an artist, how that imbues the characters' personal stories. And you talked about the stage design and what you think about as a director when you're giving, directives to singers. I think the only thing that we could talk about maybe is a favorite moment, maybe from the opera, like something that endears us to this very day. So I'm interested to hear what.
Listen,
because I don't know if it's going to be the same.
Right, totally. I mean, let's be honest. Of course, as a feminist, I'm like, totally love Tatiana. I find her fascinating. She's unendingly interesting to me. But if you're talking about like the piece that gets right into
right
my
here.
heart, it's Linsky's aria. I'm sorry. Let me just say why. You know, there's a great moment in Chekhov's play, Three Sisters, in which Tuzenbach, who knows he's about to go to a duel to die, says to Irina, his love, who does not love him back, you know, look at those trees over there. You see that one, it's dead, and yet it still waves in the wind like the others. I hope to be like that tree. And it's very, very Russian, this idea that I'm dead, but I'm still here. I'm still a part of life. And there's something very beautiful about that to me. This kind of, you know, in American culture, we don't want to talk about death. We don't want to engage with death. And in Russia, in Russian culture, like one thing we all, you know, is acknowledged, nobody's getting out alive. So, you know what I mean? It's like there's an acknowledgement. There's a real context of yes, we're alive today, we're here, we're loving, we're passionate, we're suffering, we're all of these things, and it doesn't last forever. And so for me, that Linsky aria, you know, as it's so beautifully written, and it has such a sense of that Russian understanding of death, and the complexity of friendship, like the role of duty and the role of social strictures and the importance of friendship, and yet knowing that, you know, his time has come. I mean, you know, it's like he doesn't know what's going to happen, but like, let's be honest, the man knows he's going down. And that, I think, for me, always gets me in a way that's hard to really articulate.
That's beautiful. And I would say, you know, Linsky's aria to me is all, I mean, beautifully how you have described it, right? It is all of those things. For me, I do think though, I think it's Tatiana's, the letter writing scene.
I knew she was going to say that.
Okay. I knew you were going to say Linsky too.
Yeah, that's a sister connection.
It's a sister connection because Tatiana, that letter writing scene is so, captures the moment of first love.
Yeah.
You can't, where you just are emphatic, and she's so restless and she can't sleep, and she's like, nanny, give me the pen. I need to write it down. And she asks her nanny for, you know, what, have you ever been in love before? And her nanny says, love, shmuv. Like, you know, I was 13, the matchmaker came and they married me off. I was scared. I cried. And Tatiana sees that from the nanny's perspective. But then is so enamored with Onegin because she believes him so wholeheartedly to be the one. And it's so pure. It's almost like a child's love in a sense. So uncomplicated by psychoses or needs, right, or pressures.
Previous divorces.
Anything like that, right? It's like, it is like a beautiful country landscape, you know, that kind where everything is so complete and so unique. Like that is her feeling for Onegin in that moment. And, you know, I think with the perspective of a bittersweet understanding, you were talking about feminism and how bittersweet some of the choices we have as women are in our lives. We know as audience members a kind of perspective, we are, you know, disillusioned or cynical by our own lives. But when you see Tatiana in this moment, transfixed, you're teleported to that same moment, and you can relive it through that aria with her. And so for me, that gives, you know, that's what gives me chills.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I like it.
Okay, well, we've covered it all. I feel
for today. And yet we will, of course, circle back and probably have more debates about the piece, you know, as we traverse our careers and our lives.